Yuk. Yuk.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrofil anbiya'i wal mursalin sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi washabbihi ajma'in. The Honorable Bapak Budi Agus Riswandi, our Head of Department of the Faculty of Law. The Honorable Bapak Baja, our Secretary of Department of Law. The Honorable, our distinguished speakers, Bapak Nandang Sutrisno, FH, LLM, PhD, Professor Andrew Mitchell, Bapak Christopher Kaisen, JD, and our moderator for today, Bapak Dodi Setiawan Burhedianto, SH, MH, LLM, PhD. Our beloved guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let us begin our event for the day by saying Basmalah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Entering the first agenda of the day, which is the recital of the Holy Quran verses that will be delivered by one of our students, Abi Kuhafa. To Abi, time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Minasyaitonir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Walillahi mulkus samawati wal ardi wallahu ala kulli syai'in qadir. Inna fi khalqis samawati wal ardi fil layli واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات لأولي الألباب. الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار ربنا إنك من تدخل النار فقد أخزيته وما للظالمين من أنصار وما للظالمين من أنصار صدق الله العظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Very much for Abi Kuhafa. Hopefully, with the recital of the Holy Quran that we have just listened together, will be enlightened us for the rest of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, also present with us in this morning one of our lecturers, Mrs. Liwantini. Continuing to the next agenda is the welcoming speech from the Secretary of the Department of Faculty of Law, Bapak Bagja. To Bapak Bagja, time is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa syukrulillah wala haula wala quwata illa billah. Asyhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la syarika lah wa asyhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh alladzi la nabiyya ba'da. Honorable speakers, Professor Dr. Andre Michel, Associate Professor Nandang Sutrisno MSc, Christopher Kassen GD, Honorable Faculty of Law UI Leadership, Study Program of Law, Associate Professor Budi Agustus Wandi, Secretary of Dodi Setiawan Nurhyanto PhD, other head of Central Studies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. This year, our campus Universitas Islam Indonesia is entering into 77 years. A long journey has been taken back our campus before the establishment of the Republic of Indonesia. On August 17, 1914, the founders of campus, incidentally, is the founder of this nation, such as the first former Vice President of the Republic Indonesia, Dr. Andes Muhammad Hatta. He has a great commitment to make this campus as the birthplace of scholars and scientists in the future who are able to contribute to the development of this republic. According to the first Indonesian presidential statement, Insinyur Soekarno, during his speech at the opening ceremony of this university, he stated that I hope that this university can procure people who can place Indonesia among nations and bring Indonesia to its greatness and glory. Distinguished guys, a great hope from our founding father has been given to this campus as a commitment to realize it. To this day, our campus Universitas Islam Indonesia has produced thousands of alumni who devote themselves to develop our nation either as ministers, judges of the Constitutional Court, judges of Supreme Court, judges of District Court, public prosecutors, lawyers, notaries, chairmen in government institutions, companies, CEO, professor, academic, or social activities. In addition, Alhamdulillah wa syukurulillah, on this month, our campus obtained the first rank as the best private university in Indonesia according to the Minister of Research, Technology, and University Networking Quality Insurance, or ONQA. All of these awards can be achieved after long struggle and effort in building the quality of education on this campus, and one of the form in enhance the quality of education is that we often hold international seminar in which at the beginning of this month we invited Ambassador of Hungary to Indonesia as a speaker at our Stadium General. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of our international seminar today is concerning in the international trade law. I can say that this branch of law science have an important role in building the national and the citizens' prosperity. The grand theme for international seminar is international trade on the face of growing nationalism. We do have the seminar will provide us a brief view on how the current situation and challenge of the international trade from the American, Australian, and Indonesian perspective point of view. Distinguished guys, ladies and gentlemen, I do have through this fruitful event, we can receive many benefits. For all of the participants, I wish all of us are able to gain new understanding and expand our insight throughout this international seminar. And the end of my speech, allow me to send my highest gratitude to all our speakers who have intended to become the honorable speakers in our international seminar. Also, my appreciation is given for all of community and participants who took part of have made this event come to life. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much for Bapak Badia, who has spoken to us on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Dr. Abdul Jamil SH Enbom, who is not able to present amongst us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, entering to the core agenda of this morning, which is the International Seminar on International Trade Law in the Face of Growing Nationalism. The seminar will be led by our moderator of the day, Bapak Dodi Setiawan Nur Herianto, SH, LLM, PhD. As we all know, Bapak Dodi Setiawan Nur Herianto is currently the Secretary of International Program, Faculty of Law. He is also the head and the founder of Base for International Law and Asian Legal Studies in the Faculty of Law, Universitas Islam Indonesia. He graduated from Universitas Islam Indonesia Bachelor of Law and Magister of Law, and he has also concluded his LLM and PhD studies in the University of Debrecen, Hungary, in which he was awarded as one of the best students with gold medals and silver medals. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bapak Dodi Setiawan Nur Herianto, SH, LLM, PhD.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kelly. It was very wonderful and beautiful words. But I'm sure that our speakers today is much more having reputable achievement than the moderator today. So before we start, thank you very much for Bauli, the head of the study program, for the opportunity, because this event is actually funded by the Ministry of Higher Education and Research and Technology. So, and we are also would like to thank Bapak Balia representing the leadership today. We are everybody in the leadership is hard workers, so I think they are very busy everywhere in Indonesia. And then to Artini, thank you for coming as representing the teacher and also lecturer and associate professor here from the Department of International Law. And our speakers, thank you so much. And also for the participants. Today we will have international seminar with the topic of international trade in the face of growing nationalism. So we will talk about the current situation in international trade because Indonesia is now affected with the US and China trade war. I think we are now currently want to get more investment, and we also want to have a unique products to be sent abroad to have more exported products, and we want to get more income, I think, from the export relations. And right now, also the Australian part and American part, they are also having the advanced relations with the other states relating with the trade. But we will study more about that. So I would like to call each of the speaker. Our first speaker today is graduated from the Faculty of Law Asia, and fortunately as well, He also graduated from the University of Melbourne. And he is, I always call him Pak Rector. Okay. And he also the member of the Indonesian Society of International Lecturers, along with Sutrisno SHM and PhD. Please. Terima kasih Pak. Silakan Pak. Bebas. Ya sebelah sini, sebelah saya Pak. Ya saya keluarkan kantor. Dan awet muda. Nah, Bapak Ibu sekalian, the next speaker is our teacher as well. So we are very lucky to have him stay in our university for at least right now we have him for 2 years and more I think I would like to ask him to stay for longer in Yogyakarta and in our university. And he also graduated from the Bachelor of Arts in English and Business in Washington State University and the Doctor of Jurisprudence with the award the honor of cum laude in Seattle University School of Law, and he just graduated from Florida in 2019 from the University of Miami School of Law, LLM in International Dispute Resolution, and he has outstanding expertise, I think, and practice in international dispute from South Korea and Indonesia. I don't have any time to mention all of this curriculum today, but I would like to call him Mr. Christopher Kesson, GD. And thank you, Chris. Suka Kenza. Okay. Jadi jangan sekali-sekali mengumpat dengan bahasa Jawa, bahasa Indonesia di depan Chris ya, karena dia bisa bahasa Jawa sama bahasa Inggris. Nah, the next speaker is also very famous, I think, in Australia and Indonesia because it's quite often come to Indonesia to be the speaker. And I think recently, 2 weeks ago, you met with Pak Nandan in the conference held by International Law Studies. And wow! When I got his CV is actually like more than 27 pages. So it's impossible for me to mention all of them. But he's quite active to produce scientific publications for around 140 academic books and journals. He's now the professor of Melbourne Law School and the director of Global Economic Law Network, the director of Studies International Economic Law in the Melbourne Law Masters, and also a member of the indicative list of panelists to hear WTO disputes. He has previously practiced in law with Alliance Arthur Robinson, now Alliance Partners, and consults for states, international organizations, and the private sector. Andrew, he also has taught law in Australia, Canada, Indonesia, including the Islamic University of Indonesia, Singapore, and the US, and he's the recipient of 4 major grants from the Australian Research Council, including a Future Fellowship and the Australian National Preventive Health Agency. He has published over 140 academic books and journals articles, and is a series editor of the Oxford University Press International Economic Law series, an editorial board member of the Journal of International Economic Law, and the general editor of the Journal of International Dispute Settlement. He has law degrees from Melbourne, Harvard, he graduated from Harvard Law School, and Cambridge, received his doctorate degree, PhD from the University of Cambridge, and is a barrister and solicitor in the Supreme Court of Victoria, Australia. So I would like to call him Professor Andrew Mitchell. Ya, makanya saya harus pakai Google, Pak. Nanti saya bisa mahasiswa sudah dapat press ya, nanti sudah muncul perpres. Seminar internasional pun harus dengan bahasa Indonesia. Jadi Bapak Ibu sekalian dan hadirin sekalian berbahagia, kita sudah kehadiran 3 narasumber, dan 3 narasumber ini insya Allah mereka ahli di bidangnya, baik hukum perdagangan internasional, hukum investasi internasional, dan juga hukum bisnis internasional. Nah, tema kita saat ini adalah terkait dengan perdagangan internasional di tengah tantangan terkait nasionalisme atau proteksionalisme. Jadi saat ini nanti kita akan diskusikan bagaimana situasi perdagangan internasional di Amerika Serikat, di Australia, dan di Indonesia. Nanti untuk menyimak, beliau narasumber ini akan menyampaikan sekitar 20 maksimal 25 menit untuk paparan presentasi. Itu akan saya simpulkan atau summary dalam bahasa Indonesia, dan setelah itu kita akan lanjutkan ke sesi tanya jawab. Baik, tanpa mengundur waktu, I would like to ask, I think for the first Pak Nandan Sutrisno to present about the international trade situation and whether Indonesia also has a big challenge on nationalism or not. So I would like to ask Pak Nandan.
Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi semuanya. Pak Dodi, allow me to use English.
Okay, yes, of course.
I have to maintain my English. Just to practice. Jadi kan saya menggunakan bahasa Inggris karena jarang-jarang memakai bahasa Inggris, sehingga kesempatan ini untuk berlatih sekaligus. When I received this topic, what I made it in my mind is about nationalism as understood by many people. But after I tried to access some sources, then it is a little bit different. Yeah. Because nationalism, as I understood before, is in the positive understanding. However, in this topic related to international trade, especially, and also nationalism in general, then I find that nationalism is here used as something negative. Okay. That's why I'm not surprised when I tried to look for resources. First, I was so surprised that when I read the sources are from Albert Einstein, for example. Okay. You can see here that nationalism is an infantile disease. It is the measles of mankind. Jadi nasionalisme itu adalah satu penyakit kekanak-kanakan, bagus. Bahkan disebut sebagai wabah campak yang menular, ya, di antara manusia. So up until here, it is extremely different from we perceive about nationalism, right? Nationalism, as we perceive, is that we have proud as Indonesian nationalism. Yes, it is about the proud to be a nation. Yes, it is proud to be Indonesian, for example. However, from here, if you look at the say definition, for example, what this means by nationalism here is when countries have extreme pride in nation. So the keyword is extreme pride. Okay, extreme pride. It's not only pride, but also extreme pride. Okay. So when we discuss in this room later on, as far as I perceive, then it is in a negative sense. Okay? And then how about positive sense? What we perceive as nationalism. I found that what we perceive as nationalism in positive way is what is called as patriotism. Patriotism. So when we say in Indonesia rasa kebangsaan, rasa kebangsaan, it's not nationalism but patriotism. That's why when I search some materials about international trade, when we talk about nationalism, nationalistic policies, then it is something very, very not very, but it's something negative. Yeah. Because of course negative in the view of international, not from the view of the nation itself. Okay. Even people in the international at the moment say that international trade law or the WTO law, for example, is under attack or under assault. Why? Because recently, as we said, that recently the nationalism in terms of international trade is growing. Okay, it's growing, and it is a threat against the system, the WTO system as a multilateral trading system. Okay. Related to the understanding about nationalism, there are some words that or some terms that are related one another. The first one is nationalism. In other meaning, it is a system created by people who believe that their nation is superior to all others. Okay, that's right. Einstein said that it is an extreme pride. And when I also look at another definition, it is a system that the nation is superior to all others. There is keywords of superior. That is extreme pride. And what about and then another term related to nationalism in terms of international trade is economic nationalism. What is it? It is a form of nationalism that specifically prioritizes domestic businesses. Okay. And it seeks to defend against multinational corporations that benefit from globalism. So nationalism here is the opposite of globalism, or in other words, it is against what is called as international trade liberalization. And economic nationalism is also advocates protectionism and other trade policies that protect local industries. So here it's clear that it is favor of a certain country, a certain state, or a certain nation. For example, President Trump espoused economic nationalism when he announced tariffs on steel and Chinese imports. We have already known, of you have already known as well. Yet recently we see that there is what's called as trade war. Yes. And economic nationalism also prefers bilateral trade agreements between two countries. It says that multilateral agreements benefit corporations at the expense of individual nations. It would even adopt unilateral agreements when a stronger nation forces a weaker nation to adopt trade policies that favor the stronger country. And nationalistic policies were proven to fail during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the situations when there was a economic crisis in 1929, 1930, and at the time, United States and also European countries applies what is called as mercantilism, and that's why the nationalism also related to mercantilism. At the time, what is called as nationalistic policies is that every imported goods and also services were imposed very, very high tariffs. It's more than 40%. And what was the effect of the imposition of the tariffs against the imported goods? Was that the international trade flows at the time was decreased up until 65%. Okay? So, who say that nationalism is good for the international trade? From the experience, the word experience, the nationalism may be good for a short time, but it is not good for a middle and long term. Now we return to mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic theory that advocates government regulations of international trade to generate wealth and strengthen national power. Merchants and government work together to reduce the trade deficit and create a surplus. That's why mercantilists always view that import is good and export is bad. Okay. Mercantilism is a form of economic nationalism. It advocates trade policies that protect domestic interests. Again, nationalism and also mercantilism is in the same box. Okay? And it's about protectionism. Okay? That's why then this nationalism is also related to protectionism. That is a politically motivated defensive measure. In the short run, it works, but it's very destructive in the long term. It makes the country and its industries less competitive in international trade. And trade protectionism is policy that protects domestic industries from unfair competition from foreign ones. The four primary tools are tariffs, subsidies, quotas, and currency manipulation. Okay. We can see about the methods of protectionism. I take from a source here. that at least there are four methods of protectionism. The first one is related to tariff, and it was applied in 1930 when the world fall into depressions, economic depressions. That is called as Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. It was from agricultural imports from Europe by imposing very high tariffs for agricultural products, for example. And the second one, the protectionism is also taken when the government subsidizes local industries. So in the form of international trade, the subsidize is something haram, okay? Something prohibited that allow producers to lower the price of local goods and services. So because of subsidy to the local industries, for example, then it makes the price of the local products is cheaper than the imported goods or services. And the third one, imposing quotas on imported goods. At the moment, it is also prohibited to apply quotas, to apply quantitative restrictions. And the last one is deliberate attempt by a country to lower its currency value. Of course, it is not applied to rupiah because rupiah has already been very low. But for example, China, right? China deliberating attempt to lower its currency value. Okay. Now let's see that all of these, or I have already mentioned, nationalism, mercantilism, and also protectionism, are actually central on protectionism. Yeah. So that's why protectionism start from mercantilism to neo-mercantilism. Now we enter to neo-mercantilism. Okay. So the period that I try to know about protectionism is the first one is mercantilism. It was developed around the year of 1500 to 1800 or something. And then nationalism was born after Westphalia Treaty. Okay? And then after that, liberalism or globalism, and then liberalism was then failed, then changed to nationalism again in 1930 by imposing very high tariff, 40 to 48% on 900 goods or services, and then turn to neoliberalism, yeah, trade liberalization, including the revolt of the WTO. And then at the moment, the era or the period of neo-mercantilism signed by the trade war. Okay. So how about protectionism under the WTO? Of course, in the WTO, no protectionism, no nationalism, because the WTO has its own basic principles. And then under the WTO, it is allowed to apply something against the WTO if there is an emergency. For example, if there is a sudden import, and then it is also allowed to safeguard the nations from the imported goods, and then the states or the country also allowed to be exempted under Article 20 of the GATT, and also the exception for regional trade agreements. As I said, that there is a term at the moment that the WTO under attack of nationalism, signed by trade war, for example, how trade war works, and then regionalism also on one side it's good, but on the other side it is also like a trade for multilateralism, and then also bilateralism, and almost applied by most members of the WTO at the moment. And then this the unilateralism is the most dangerous at the moment, because it's like agreements, but it is like forced agreements. Yang terpaksa. Okay. And then the last one is dispute settlement cases. Up until now, there are 590 disputes among WTO members, and of 590 disputes, there are over 350 rulings issued. And what about Indonesia? Indonesia at the moment is facing trade deficits, as we have already known. And then at the moment, also very developing the issue about the resistance to import. Okay, and we can ask whether or not it is like a neo-mercantilism. Okay, because at the moment, almost all Indonesians think that import is bad, right? And then what we need is national interest, that is patriotism, not nationalism. Okay? And at the moment, Indonesia has 67 cases in the WTO, including as a respondent, as claimants, and also as the party. And we have also at the moment, I just read the news today that our government will bring the European Union to the WTO in the case of biofuel. It is related to CPO, okay, about minyak sawit, which is restricted in European Union. And then it is also very recently that we have already had what is called as Halal Act, okay? Undang-Undang Jaminan Produk Halal, that is effective since last month, since October. And of course, from the perspective of international trade law, from the perspective of international liberalizations of trade, then it may be viewed as nationalist policy, as nationalist laws related to economic law. And how about the way forward? The first one, the experience show that the more the international trade, the better. More trade is better than less trade. National trade policies mostly failed. Jadi pengalaman menunjukkan di berbagai negara, termasuk di Amerika, di Eropa, including in the United States, that when the trade is restricted, then it's fair. It is not supported for economic development. So how the way forward? We have to be back to the WTO law-based rules, okay. And then we have to be back also to multilateralism. And if there is another member act something that is disadvantageous for other members, then go to the ASP. not to act unilaterally. And then we should also reject. What about if they reject to implement the BSB result or the BSB report? Then there must be a collective retaliation. How can a country member of the WTO stand if it is retaliated by so many countries? Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Semacam kesimpulan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Jadi pada tadi bahwa ada istilah nasionalisme itu tadi ternyata setelah dicari itu banyak sekali referensi. Tetapi selama ini prakteknya itu adalah diinterpretasikan yang positif atau rasa kebangsaan. Padahal nasionalisme itu juga bisa dianggap sebagai wabah atau penyakit yang menular seperti kata Albert Einstein, dan juga dalam artian yang negatif. Seperti tadi, rasa kebangsaan atau patriotisme itu memiliki arti yang positif, tetapi ada istilah nasionalisme yang memiliki definisi yang negatif, khususnya jika dilihat dari perspektif hukum perdagangan internasional. Nah, hukum perdagangan internasional sekarang saat ini sedang mendapatkan serangan yang bertubi-tubi karena banyaknya sekali negara-negara di dunia ini melakukan istilahnya proteksi internal yang berbasis pada nasionalisme itu tadi, sehingga dianggap oleh beliau Bapak Asosiat Profesor Nandang itu sebagai tabu dan tanda-tanda bahaya seperti itu. Ada tadi istilah nasionalisme ekonomi. Nasionalisme ekonomi itu adalah proteksi ekonomi nasional untuk menghindari atau melindungi ekonomi nasional dari paparan globalisme atau hubungan-hubungan dagang internasional. Nah, tadi diberi contoh model-model proteksionisme atau nasionalisme itu tadi seperti subsidi pemerintah, penetapan kuota, kemudian ada pengenaan tarif bagi barang-barang impor yang berasal dari luar negeri. Dan saat ini kita punya yang namanya rezim organisasi perdagangan internasional. Rezim organisasi perdagangan internasional ini memiliki konsep atau kerangka bahwa diharapkan agar negara-negara itu tidak memiliki proteksionalisme atau nasionalisme, dan jikapun harus dilakukan itu hanya untuk saat-saat tertentu saja, seperti impor yang mendesak atau untuk melindungi kepentingan nasional. Dan pengecualian itu pun juga sudah diberikan oleh aturan-aturan organisasi perdagangan internasional seperti kerangka safeguard, kemudian pengecualian yang diatur dalam pasal 20 General Agreement Tariff Trade, persetujuan umum terkait dengan tarif perdagangan. Dan kemudian di Indonesia saat ini kita sedang menghadapi defisit perdagangan. Jadi angka ekspor kita masih sangat rendah ya Pak, tadi sudah disebutkan. Dan Indonesia masyarakatnya masih resisten untuk impor. Jadi masyarakat masih menganggap impor itu tidak baik. Meskipun anak-anak muda generasi milenial, mohon maaf saya tambahkan, kalau saya lihat sekarang kalau ke kampus itu brand yang dipakai untuk sepatu dari bawah sampai atas itu brand impor semua. Jadi mungkin beda ya dengan generasi milenial saat ini. Atau mungkin yang merek-merek Cibaduit, tapi mereknya slang. Nah, dan juga national interest. Jadi Indonesia masih punya kepentingan nasional seperti tadi disebutkan kasusnya minyak kelapa sawit atau CPO. Dan tantangan yang terdepan sangat banyak sekali. Tadi disebutkan oleh Pak Nandang bahwa diharapkan banyak perdagangan atau kesadaran untuk melakukan hubungan perdagangan itu penting, dan diharapkan ini bisa menumbuhkan apa istilahnya sisi positif untuk ekonomi, khususnya untuk Indonesia dan di negara-negara lain. Mungkin itu tadi untuk ringkasan dari penjelasan dari Pak Nandang Sutrisno. For the next speaker, I think Christopher, you have 25 minutes maximum to present for your paper.
to thank you to the leadership of OEE for again inviting me, and thank you, Mark Obi, for the kind introduction. And also, thank you to Pak Nandang, who did a fantastic introduction to and a fantastic definition of many of the isms that we're talking about today. So I like to start off with a quote. This one is from William Shakespeare in one of his many plays. It says, busy, giddy minds with foreign quarrels. What does that mean? It's, I know, very old style English of Shakespeare. But it basically means it was a king giving advice to his son, saying, when you are in trouble, try to distract the people by creating conflicts with other countries. And I like this quote because it kind of explains why we, meaning the United States, is in a trade war with China. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about what we call and what Pagnandam articulated as the isms: protectionism, globalism, patriotism, nationalism. And then I'd like to sort of talk about why the United States, or how did we end up in a trade war with China? Okay. Was it nationalism? Was it economic nationalism? How did we get here? And then last, I'd like to talk about the impact of the trade war. And I should say the impact until now, because it's still ongoing. It hasn't not been resolved. And we may not know for a long time what the actual impact on our economy as Americans, the Indonesian economy, and the global economy. Again, Paknam did such a fantastic job of defining the isms that I don't want to dwell too much on that. I would like to point out another ism, and that's colonialism. And the only reason I want to point out the word colonialism is that it's been often used by nationalists as a justification for protectionism. So, for example, those opponents of foreign direct investment, for example, in Indonesia, have often said foreign direct investment is similar to colonialism. And so this nationalism, economic nationalism, has been sort of some of the rhetoric has been an objection towards colonialism. And I think it's important because what I'm going to talk about more is that
economic and trade decisions are not always made purely for economic reasons. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about how did the United States and China end up in the trade war. So there are two sets of reasons why the United States decided to impose tariffs on Chinese products, including steel, including electronics. Why did we do this? There's two sets. One set is the official justification, and the other is the political motivation. So I'd like to start off with what is the official justification. We've basically established four reasons. One, a trade imbalance between the United States and China. The next, national security. The third, intellectual property protection. And the fourth is sort of a technical term when it comes to dealing with the World Trade Organization. The assertion that China is not a market economy, a non-market economy, and we can deal with it differently. So it may be hard to read if you're way in the back, but this starts in 2002 and up until present. And this is what we call the trade imbalance, the trade deficit. So in the red are the United States exports to China. And in the blue on the bottom are imports from China by the United States. And even if you can't see the exact numbers, you can see the obvious relationship. So obviously the United States imports far more from China than it exports to China. Who cares, right? Why is this important? Is this a sign of unfairness between China and the United States? Is this a sign that China is doing something wrong? It's unclear, but it's not necessarily true that this is fault or it's the United States' fault or anybody's fault in particular. Some would argue this is just part of the natural industrial cycle. So for example, China imports raw materials all over the world, East Asia, Africa, etc. They export them to America. And in fact, although China has a trade surplus with America, it actually has a trade deficit to the countries that it imports its raw materials from. So it's not as if China has a trade that all countries have a trade deficit to China. Okay, another reason why there is imbalance is Americans just buy too much. And we did up until, we used to follow a system called Bretton Woods, which was sometimes referred to as the gold standard. Meaning for every American dollar that was around the world, there was a little bit of gold, MS, in a big building. And what that did was it limited how much money Americans could spend. We spent so much, we just ran out of money. And so in 1971, we eliminated the gold standard. And what that allowed was the American economy to spend as much money as it wanted. And that dramatically increased the amount of imports into America and thereby increased the trade deficit. So there's very little evidence that China has acted unfairly, even though that's been one of the major justifications for imposing tariffs. Another justification is national security. Having this trade imbalance and by relying on China for steel and raw materials and technology, it's making the United States secure. This is the second argument. Chinese are using technology to spy on Americans. And so it has to be restricted. Okay, and the third is intellectual property protection. Okay. There have been numerous allegations that the Chinese, whether private firms or government, have stolen intellectual property from the United States. And finally, China is a non-market economy. Basically, it's cheating by manipulating the action of its goods. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So those are the official reasons why the United States has imposed on Chinese goods. Now, as I've said many times in many different situations, there's really a difference of opinion within America, whether the policies, our trade policies right now, are helping or hurting America. And so I'd like to offer an alternative motivation as to why we've imposed tariffs. Reasons for what I call political reasons for the trade war. Okay, if anybody is in politics, if you're a politician and you've been elected as president or member of parliament or etc., what's your number one goal? To help the people? To help the economy? Your number one goal is to be elected again in the future. And I don't mean to be cynical, but I think that a lot of the trade policies are in pursuit of trying to get elected again. And in order to get elected again, there was a promise to bring back manufacturing. Obviously, it's very expensive to manufacture cars, electronics, like that in America. The cost of our labor is so much higher than the cost of labor in China. Things. But there was a promise made to bring back manufacturing to America. And the promise was actually made to a specific group of people within America. Of America, where they used to manufacture cars and steel, etc. But those jobs have gone overseas for purely economic reasons. But based on our electoral system, if you're unfamiliar in America, when we elect a president, it's not a direct election. And I could talk all day about our electoral college system. But what it means is that people in these states where manufacturing used to be big, but now jobs, have a disproportional power to elect the president. And so the promise to bring back manufacturing was directed towards that. And it was very politically popular to say how unfair we've been treated by China. Whether it's true or not true, it's being used for political reasons rather than economic reasons. Tools and sanctions are a result of this political calculation that says if we impose tariffs, regardless of whether it will actually have any positive economic effect, it will have a positive political effect. So if I fight with China, I will be more popular in certain places in America. The legal impact regarding the World Trade Organization, and again, I don't want to better articulate the interest that World Trade Organization works, but it essentially functions to prevent countries from imposing tariffs or illegal subsidies, etc., to promote free trade. So the idea of imposing tariffs is the complete opposite of what the World Trade Organization stands for. The only difficult thing is, if you're familiar with the World Trade Organization, even if you win a case based on tariffs, the remedy, the World Trade Organization allows you to impose reciprocal tariffs on the other country from the United States. So the legal impact of the trade war is very minimal. This will be very unlikely that any action between the United States and China will end up as a case before the World Trade Organization or the International Court of Justice. However, there's been a huge impact on the people that were promised benefits from these tariffs. For example, the most striking example is soya farmers. The soy farm, their largest market is China. And they've lost a huge amount of money by these tariffs. So it's actually hurt the people who voted for our current president. So I see my time is up, and I'd like to encourage you to ask questions at the end of the session. And so I'll leave it at that. Say it's important to know not just what the trade war is, but how it started. And I will leave open how and when it will end. So thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Chris. So, sangat luar biasa penjelasannya tadi, bisa memberikan gambaran kepada kita terkait dengan masalah perdagangan di Amerika Serikat. Tadi diawali penjelasannya itu dengan salah satu kata yang disampaikan oleh William Shakespeare. Jadi intinya tadi artinya adalah jika kita dalam masalah, kita harus meminta orang lain untuk atau kita harus membuat masalah dengan banyak negara atau dengan orang lain. Ini kayaknya dosen-dosen kita juga sudah mulai menerapkan prinsip yang diberikan William Shakespeare. Jika mahasiswa berada dalam masalah belum dapat diskusi, maka buatlah masalah. Nah, saat ini Amerika Serikat sedang menghadapi perang dagang, Bapak Ibu sekalian, dan tadi disampaikan oleh Chris sama juga dengan penjelasan yang disampaikan oleh sifat atau kebijakan yang mana itu untuk melindungi kepentingan internal dari ekonomi negara tersebut. Dan tadi Christopher juga sudah menjelaskan terkait dengan justifikasi pengenaan tarif. Itu juga banyak sekali alasannya, itu karena ketidakseimbangan dagang, perlindungan haki, kemudian keamanan nasional. Karena kasus dagang Amerika Serikat ini, Amerika Serikat tidak ingin industri lokalnya banyak dicuri, kekayaan intelektualnya dengan negara lain, sehingga perlu ada di proteksi. Dan juga tadi disebutkan sangat menarik sekali di akhir tadi, alasan politik dari terjadinya perang dagang di Amerika Serikat dengan China, itu sebenarnya salah satu tujuannya itu ada kepentingan politik juga dari Presiden Donald Trump, bahwa tujuan utama biasanya jadi presiden itu adalah bukan karena ingin menyejahterakan masyarakat, tapi yaitu inilah istilahnya jargon yang dikampanyekan. Tetapi tujuan utamanya biasanya adalah agar dia bisa dipilih kembali. Nah, dan kemudian alasan yang lain itu adalah untuk meningkatkan produksi atau manufacturing di Amerika Serikat, dan Amerika Serikat menganggap bahwa negara Cina itu adalah target yang mudah dikalahkan, sehingga ini menjadi alasan mengapa mereka melakukan perang dagang dengan dengan Cina. Baik, saya kira seperti itu tadi summarize-nya. The next will be Professor Andrew, so you have next 5 minutes to say. So now I give the time and force you.
Expect the presentation to be loaded on.
Okay. Yeah, yes.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for the kind invitation to be here. It's a real honour for me to be speaking at Indonesia's oldest law school, and I'd like to thank you all very much for attending this seminar. So the two previous excellent presentations have provided a very good foundation for what I'll be talking about. We've had a higher level presentations that have examined the terminology that's involved in this seminar and the key ideas, as well as one of the key aspects of trade tensions and nationalism at the moment with the US-China trade war. What I want to talk about is a particular aspect of current trade tensions, which is to do with regulating the flow of data as it crosses borders. And regulating data across borders requires different types of legal and regulatory interventions, both at a domestic, at a regional, and at a international and transnational level. It also involves a number of different types of law, including data protection law, intellectual property law, privacy law, and human rights law. This will all be relevant to the regulation of data as it flows across borders. And all of these different areas of law can be applied to achieve different objectives. This area is also very complex because it involves a wide range of different stakeholders. They include private companies that are largely responsible for providing the infrastructure used for data flows and the different technology behind different data offerings. We have governments involved that are concerned with regulating data flows in the public interest. And we also have the multi-stakeholder internet governance community, which deals with different aspects of governance in relation to the internet, including engineering and policy issues. And in my presentation, I wanted to explain the different regulatory issues that are related to data flows and those that are related to trade law, and discuss how various trade-related aspects of data flows can be integrated into the WTO framework. The key message of this presentation is that the WTO rules need to be reformed by adding more well-balanced and comprehensive provisions on data flows, and to bring more clarity and more legal certainty. But the trade rules here don't need to just be modified to be more conducive to liberalising digital trade services and data flows, but they also need to be modified in a way that creates more business and consumer trust in the global digital trade framework. So what I'm proposing in this presentation is a much more comprehensive framework that combines obligations on states to allow the free flow of data with complementary rules on online consumer protection, privacy and cybersecurity. Now, a similar approach has been adopted in some preferential law, otherwise known as free trade agreements. But WTO rules need to be adapted specifically for the multilateral environment, where obviously the policy interests and the ideologies and the regulatory frameworks are much more diverse. So data flows generate significant economic opportunities as well as efficiencies across all different sectors of the economy, including through the expansion of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and big data processing. A general consensus exists in the international community that data flows are essential for promoting digital innovation, consumer well-being and choice, and enabling economic growth. And we've just got to see, say, Indonesia's capacity for digital innovation with platforms such as Gojek and GoLive. But it's not just important for economic growth. The free flow of data can also relate to important human rights, such as expression and the right to access information. But set against this, there are a number of stakeholders that are concerned, that have concerns regarding what the consequences might be if there's an uninhibited and unregulated flow of data. So they're concerned about protecting the digital rights, for example, of users and safeguarding them from the unethical data practices that are rampant in the industry, or to ensure that users' data is kept secure and kept private, to enable to data, so to make sure that national agencies are able to perform their regulatory functions by getting hold and accessing the information they need to be able to do their regulatory tasks. And as well as a concern to enable fair competition in the data industry, particularly countering what some see as the influence of, say, American or perhaps Chinese data monopolies. So these different rationales reflect the different ways in which data restrictions are framed by governments. The majority of data restrictions or cybersecurity measures are unsurprising, given that we all know about the security and privacy risks involved in data transfers. However, I would ask whether the tools that are being used to contain these sorts of risks, such as data localization measures or very extensive compliance procedures, such as we've seen in the EU's GDPR or the Chinese cybersecurity law, actually produce the desired benefits that they are trying to achieve. I think it would be actually much better if governments adopted a risk-based or principles-based approach to regulating data, but that's not the approach that governments tend to follow. They tend to prefer much more prescriptive laws, given the sensitivities of the issues that are involved. So this sets out some of the other rationales that might also inform government restrictions on data flow. So it includes the desire to ensure regulatory access to data, but also a desire to exercise greater control over the domestic internet and information flow. So to protect what some countries refer to as cyber sovereignty. And then finally, a desire to maximise the benefits of the data sector or homegrown businesses. And so this here is a type of digital industrial policy. So for instance, India and South Africa have expressed an interest in taxing data as it moves across borders, because they believe that will create more opportunities for local companies to utilise local data. Now, while data transfers are often associated with industries in the services sector, it's actually data are essential for firms in all sectors in support of their business activity. And so here, this diagram looks at how data flows are essential for, say, manufacturing businesses. So in manufacturing, at the design stage, data helps coordinate research from design outputs that are often flowing from different countries. Data helps exercise overarching control and coordination of geographically dispersed processes of production, including the enabling small and medium-sized enterprises to integrate in global value chains, where the production of a particular product is spread across many different countries. Then at the delivery stage of a product, data helps exercise, data transfers are needed to both enable the tracking and tracing of products as they travel to the border and then beyond the border. And so they're a key element in trade facilitation. And then when the product actually arrives to the consumer, data enables feedback mechanisms that allow consumers to interact with their smart products, whether that's a smartphone or a smart speaker or some other connected device. So all of these different elements, whether at their individual stages or taken as a whole, require a continuous digital connectivity via information and communication links, which support this digital thread that runs through the production process. So you can see here, because data is so important in the way that we produce things, if we impose conditions on the access to or the use of information as it flows, that affects the efficiency of different stages of production and, in fact, the viability of the value chain itself for modern manufacturing. Now, although the last slide indicates that data is so important, we can see from this slide that countries are placing conditions on the transfer of data across borders or requiring that data be stored locally. And this type of regulation, as I mentioned before, can directly affect the ability to trade and digitise goods and services, and can have broader trade consequences, such as when it affects data flows that are critical for the coordination of global value chains. So this is becoming an issue that's causing trade tensions. Even just having a patchwork of different regulations and laws can make it much harder for micro, small and medium-sized enterprises to be able to benefit from digital trade. And we all know that that's one of the great promises of digital trade. It allows a very small business, it might just be a mum and dad business in a small village, but are able to sell their goods anywhere in the world using some global platform, such as Amazon or another platform. Now, not all data regulation is the same, and this slide sets out approaches which are emerging. And these approaches are not all mutually exclusive. So, for example, they might use one system for one type of data and another system for another type of data, even in the same jurisdiction. So, for example, data related to someone's health might be treated more restrictively than data that's, say, related to product maintenance. And we can see here the four different very broad options. Now, at the WTO, the members of the WTO have made a joint statement initiative to try to evaluate how WTO rules can be updated to liberalise the data-driven sectors. Now, given the complexity of the data regulation, I think any new type of provision needs to be devised in a very careful manner, keeping both in mind the broader context of data governance and the specific areas in which trade regulation can meaningfully contribute. The fast-changing nature of the supply of digital trade services, which largely consists of unregulated and direct relationships between suppliers and individual consumers, and the scale and the nature of the challenges that arises from these new types of relationships was simply not envisaged when the trade rules at the WTO were originally formulated. In my view, to enable digital trade and data flows really requires that all trading partners adopt a very basic regulatory framework that provides for online consumer protection, provides for data protection, rules on spam, cybersecurity, and so on. Once this framework is in place, then it allows for a free flow of data in a trusted digital ecosystem. And at the moment, the existing rules of the WTO make no such requirement for countries to have such a basic framework. So the main problem that arises here is not because the fundamental principles are absent in WTO law, but because these rules were not tailored for the digital services environment, which creates legal uncertainty and interpretive challenges when we're trying to apply dated rules to modern day digital services. And so in my proposed regulatory framework, I discuss next the three fundamental pillars of data regulation in international trade, and then based on those principles, discuss important provisions that should be included in the WTO framework. So what are the foundations of a digital trade framework? The first is that we need digital trust. So data restrictions arise primarily because of mistrust in digital ecosystems. Mistrust amongst stakeholders, mistrust amongst governments, between governments and companies, and even between governments, companies, and individual users. Now, given that we have 164 members in the WTO that have very diverse policies and ideologies, it's unsurprising perhaps that there is a large trust deficit in the digital trade framework, and this leads to data restrictive measures. WTO rules can play an important role here in contributing to a culture of digital trust, both from the point of view of consumers and businesses. As I said before, the WTO can do this by requiring members to adopt a basic regulatory framework, but also by facilitating dialogue and cooperation among relevant stakeholders, and also permitting its members to take measures that are necessary to ensure digital trust, but provided that those types of measures are non-discriminatory and not unreasonable, and as far as possible, aligned with internationally recognised norms and best practices in the industry. The second pillar is ensuring transparency and interoperability. So regulatory harmonisation in privacy or cybersecurity is impossible. However, the WTO can facilitate regulatory cooperation and eventually interoperability of different domestic regulatory frameworks. So the WTO rules here need to be framed to accommodate universally recognised private and multi-stakeholder standards that are common to internet services. And the basic principles of transparency are very important here because the data restrictive rules that a number of countries have imposed are very opaque and ambiguous. And this causes confusion for foreign suppliers and consumers. The third pillar is that we need new regulatory approaches here. The WTO is based on conventional state-to-state relations, but data flow regulation, as I mentioned in the beginning, also involves the multi-stakeholder internet governance bodies and also private companies, not just governments. In fact, these other bodies, these non-government bodies, play a very positive role in contributing and enabling an open and secure environment for data flows. So what we need is a co-regulatory approach where regulations are occurring not just by government but also these other bodies. But this is a big change for the WTO. So the WTO hasn't previously liaised with the Internet Policy Committee, and the role of private standards at the WTO is very unclear. But I think it's time for the WTO to consider innovative ideas for multi-stakeholder participation in providing rules on data flows. Now, how much time do I have left? 30 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. So I might just skip very quickly to look at the legal framework for data flows in the WTO and the key areas that should be covered in a WTO framework. I can discuss this more if we go into when we go into questions if there's interest. But the first is that we need a horizontal obligation on cross-border data flows and a prohibition on data localization. We need to require all countries to adopt data protection frameworks and promote mutual recognition. We need international cooperation on cybersecurity issues, and we need to integrate more online consumer protection and enable digital innovation and promote digital trust, including providing due consideration to what are international best practices and internationally recognised standards in the private sector. And then finally, we need special and differential treatment for developing countries. So certain developing countries have claimed that data restrictive measures are necessary to be able to, for them to be able to their digital services sector and to protect their economic and their social interests. So for example, they're concerned about preventing tariff losses and revenue losses that result, say, from the moratorium that currently exists on imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions. The position of these developing countries has been extremely strongly supported by various civil society groups that argue that the WTO is a completely inappropriate forum to set rules on electronic commerce, and that it would deprive developing countries from digitalising in a meaningful manner and would prevent them from adopting laws that are necessary to protect their consumers. But I think this is completely wrong. The diverse membership of the WTO makes it actually a great forum for developing countries to talk about the needs that they have and their concerns regarding data flows and what their digital development needs are. Also, the WTO framework does not prevent members from regulating the internet to achieve their legitimate policy objectives. So to conclude, the future of trade in digital services and data entails complex and uncertain policy challenges. And balancing different regulatory concerns is fundamental to ensure that there's a coherent and sustainable framework for data flows. Being the leading multilateral institution, the WTO is extremely well placed to undertake several of the required reforms here to bring about a better balance between promoting the free flow of data while protecting a secure and stable regulatory environment for data and addressing the interests of consumers and businesses. Thank you very much.
Saya penjelasan yang diberikan oleh Profesor Andrew itu termasuk isu yang sangat sudah berkembang, yaitu terkait dengan transmisi pertukaran atau jual beli data yang saat ini sudah mulai berkembang di tingkat regional maupun internasional. Dan saya kira kita juga sudah mengalami sendiri, misalnya saat ini seperti di HP kita itu kan ada banyak aplikasinya. Seperti WhatsApp saja itu sudah satu perusahaan yang memiliki WhatsApp, dan itu kita sendiri yang submit data setiap hari. Misalnya saya dengan istri kirim foto ke anak dan lain sebagainya, istri kirim data terkait dengan keuangan rumah misalnya seperti itu di dalam WA. Jaminannya seperti apa? Ini kemudian bisa diperjualbelikan atau dipertukarkan atau kemudian bisa dan data ini tidak hanya dibuat WhatsApp juga, tetapi juga di perbankan dan juga di banyak sekali perusahaan-perusahaan penyedia jasa yang saat ini mengenerate data-data yang berasal dari konsumen atau dari klien. Nah, saat ini juga ada banyak sekali tantangan, seperti pemerintah itu memiliki tantangan bagaimana agar data yang saat ini di-generate kemudian diperjualbelikan, ditransmisikan itu agar bisa dilindungi untuk kepentingan publik. Dan juga di pihak industri juga saat ini sudah mulai mengembangkan dan sudah mulai masif sekali bagaimana data ini bisa di-generate, kemudian diproduksi dan bahkan juga ditransaksikan. Nah, khususnya terkait dengan WTO saat ini sudah mulai ada pengaturan, dan Profesor Andrew sendiri tadi memberikan penjelasan bahwa harapannya pengaturan itu menggunakan pendekatan berbasis prinsip, karena di sektor terkait data ini tidak hanya berbicara masalah bagaimana dokumentasikan mendapatkan data, tetapi juga sudah mulai ada pelacakan data, kemudian penggunaan data, proses pendapatan data tersebut, kemudian juga riset bagaimana untuk menciptakan sistemnya. Jadi sudah mulai banyak sekali sektor yang mungkin bisa diatur, sehingga terkait dengan jual beli transmisi data ini bisa dilakukan, diatur. Nah, di mana prinsip di mana perlindungan nasionalismenya? Jadi tadi kita berbicara masalah nasionalisme terkait dengan data juga ada. Sekarang sudah mulai negara-negara di dunia, khususnya tadi disebutkan di India dan di Afrika, negara-negara tersebut sudah mulai melakukan pengenaan tarif jika data-data yang ada di negaranya itu mau dibawa keluar untuk kepentingan tertentu. Nah, sekarang sudah mulai ada, diharapkan juga pengaturan itu sudah mulai masuk ke digital trade transaction. Jadi sudah ada transaksi data-data digital, dan diharapkan juga sampai mengatur rezim WTO itu sampai ke digital trust, adanya kepercayaan bagaimana cara memfasilitasi ketika konsumen atau antara bisnis, hubungan bisnis yang ada itu bisa menjamin adanya trust, sehingga tidak ada penyalahgunaan atau pelanggaran terhadap etika, dan juga harmonisasi dengan standar-standar aturan lain seperti HAM, karena data itu sendiri berkaitan dengan banyak norma-norma HAM, seperti hak untuk mengakses informasi dan juga kebebasan berekspresi. Dan juga yang paling penting itu adalah jaminan atas individu yang ada. Dan kemudian isu-isu lain yang perlu dibahas dalam rezim WTO untuk merespon transaksi data elektronik ini, seperti cyber security, saat ini juga harus dikuatkan. Kemudian pengaturan terkait sejauh mana atau pajak untuk transmisi data. Saya kira itu dan sangat bagus sekali. Mungkin itu bisa jadi inspirasi mahasiswa untuk menyusun tesis. Kalau tadi kalau nggak ada judul bikin masalah, lah sekarang nggak perlu bikin masalah, sudah ada banyak referensi judul-judul untuk melakukan skripsi di bidang hukum perdagangan internasional. Baik, saya kira itu ringkasan yang sudah disampaikan. Nah, sekarang for now, we have the session for question and answer. I would like to open the first session. So please raise your hand, mention your name, and then I think your position as student at undergraduate or a master or PhD. Then please mention about the question. Okay, so do you have any questions? Okay. Jangan khawatir kalau pertanyaannya dalam bahasa Indonesia, tugas saya adalah mempersembahkan. Sebut nama ya Pak, nama, dari mana, kemudian pertanyaan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Nama saya Muhammad Dalis. Saya bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia saja. Terkait dengan topik bahasan pada seminar ini, saya sangat tertarik sekali terkait dengan nasionalisme. Karena kita ketahui bahwa nasionalisme juga yang sampai ke pandangan tadi ada negatif dan positif. Apabila dikaitkan dengan kedaulatan juga ada aspek negatif dan positif serta internal maupun eksternal. Amerika misalnya tadi baik eksternal maupun internalnya menginginkan adanya kepentingan untuk nasionalnya agar perdagangan tetap berjalan dengan baik, termasuk China dan termasuk juga Indonesia. Kira-kira terkait dengan permasalahan ini dalam perdagangan internasional, bagaimana sih menyatukan antara negara-negara yang banyak ini sehingga memang perdagangan internasional itu memiliki nilai yang positif bagi semua negara. Mungkin demikian. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Darwis. Ada pertanyaan lain? Ada? Ada pertanyaan? Tidak ada pertanyaan? Sepertinya sedang mengenerate data ini oleh masing-masing. Ya, oke. Ada satu pertanyaan. We have one question. It's about the nationalism and sovereignty. Pertanyaannya itu siapa? Semuanya. Okay. Is there any relations between the nationalism and sovereignty? And then, what do you think about the sovereignty that it has a positive and negative side, portrait? Mungkin dari mana dulu?
I meant to speak English. Relation between national and also sovereignty related to
international trade? Such a question. Okay. WTO members are all sovereign states, but some what do you call it, customary. So it is what do you call it? All of the WTO members are sovereign states and are guaranteed that there is no distraction on the sovereignty. Okay. There is no force to be a member of the WTO, and all of the members signs the agreement voluntarily. So when they enter into the WTO agreement, then there is no alternative except to abide by the provisions, the agreements of the WTO. When they comply with the WTO provisions, it doesn't mean that their sovereignty are reduced. Instead, they practice the sovereign rights, the sovereignty. This is sometimes misled by people. Even in the first history of the establishment of the WTO, called as ITO, International Trade Organizations, United States didn't ratify the WTO, the ITO, because of sovereignty at that time. But I think, in my view, when a country or member enter into the WTO agreement, it means they practice, they will their sovereignty. Signing agreement, signing treaty is practicing sovereignty, because only the sovereign states that can sign the treaty or the WTO. Okay. The problem is that it is not about the sovereignty, okay, but it is about the ability to take advantage from the WTO agreement. Okay. How far a member state can take advantage from, ideally, WTO provisions benefit all the parties. Okay. But once again, this is the reality that not all countries have the same positions to gain from the agreements. Even big country or strong country like United States, when it enters into the WTO and applies its sovereignty, okay, it is less advantageous than China. And Chris has shown that there is a big or wide range of deficit So once again, this is not about sovereignty, but it is about maybe it is about the portions to take advantage from the cake of the WTO provisions. Okay. That's all.
Thank you for your question, and thank you, Partner. I think I'll take a different approach to the answer, talking more generally about sovereignty and nationalism. Again, nationalism in sort of the negative meaning, as opposed to patriotism in the positive meaning. I think how sovereignty relates to nationalism in the sense that threats to sovereignty, whether it's through international treaties or direct investment, liberalization of investment laws, that the globalization is seen as a threat to sovereignty, and that threat is often used to invoke nationalism. So a lot of nationalism in the negative way, I think, is about invoking fear of non-nationals, so to speak. And one way to do that is through invoking this threat to sovereignty. So the WTO is a threat to sovereignty, so we must be more nationalist. Foreign direct investment is a form of colonialism, again, a threat to sovereignty. And so I think one sort of the fear of losing sovereignty is what a lot of the rhetoric and the political rhetoric about that unites people in a more nationalistic thinking. And then, of course, it results in more nationalistic economic policies or fear on that sovereignty. So I think that's how I would kind of articulate how I see terms working together. And I'll pass on to my colleague here to answer your question. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That's a great question, and I think the other two colleagues have done a great job in answering it. I mean, really, the act of entering into a treaty such as joining the WTO is an act of sovereignty by the state. The state has, as it was explained, chosen to enter into the treaty, presumably to recognise some advantage. And in the case of international trade, the theory is that entering into this sort of treaty allows more cooperation between states on trade, lowers barriers to trade, allows countries to recognise and exploit their comparative advantages, and that creates welfare improvements not just in one country but globally. So I don't see sort of any contradiction between sovereignty and entering into treaties such as the WTO. It's the same issue for any sorts of treaties that the state enters into, whether it's a human rights treaty or a trade treaty.
Okay, so thank you. Is there any question? No? Really? Karena yang pertanyaan sudah saya siapkan coklat ini, nanti berarti yang beruntung cuma Pak Darwis ini. Coklat khusus merek UI mahal sekali dicetak terbatas. Oke? This will be, you will be very lucky if there is no more questions because I still have 3 chocolates for all the speakers. Oke, saya kira tidak ada pertanyaan ini. Oke, Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, I think because our students is so smart, because and they are so understand very well. Jadi Pak Nanda nanti kan ada banyak dari kelas Nanda nanti bisa dijadikan ujian gitu kan. Bisa kira sudah siap semua. So thank you very much for your participation, dan saya akan memberikan satu coklat untuk Pak Darwis. Mr. Darwis is the student at the doctoral school in law, so you're very fortunate. Coklat khusus merek UI. Ya, ini hanya dijual, tidak dijual beli secara publik, and we are very lucky because all the speakers get one coklat for me. Ya, saya kira ini hari ini bukan hari Valentine, Pak. Ya, bagi coklat, ya, bagi kartu, bagi coklat. Ya, okay. So thank you very much. Thank you for Professor Andrew, Professor Christopher, and also. Ya, ini seperti kuliah ya, Bapak. And thank you very much for all the participants, for the participation. And I think we still have one more session. Can you call somebody there outside to prepare? So I would like to ask all the speakers to stand up in front of the stage. Yeah. Saya mungkin yang kasih ya. Yeah. Okay. So please stand up here, and I would like to give you some. So thank you very much for the number and certificate. Yeah. Okay. Bapak tulis dulu, Bapak. Ya. Oke. One more. Sedikit tambah ya, Pak ya. Oke, terima kasih. Kita tutup bersama. Tadi begitu. Oke. Okay, so thank you very much. And come back and prepare for the last session. So terima kasih atas partisipasinya. Mari kita tutup dengan membaca hamdalah bersama-sama. Alhamdulillahirobbilalamin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sertifikat bisa diambil di luar ruangan, sudah disediakan. Mohon agar bisa tanda tangan dan menerima sertifikat.